Jay, first off, thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time today. For the folks on the call, I took a lot of time to really get to know Jay before this, and he just is a treasure trove of valuable insights. And so I think you all will really have your notebooks ready. I'll share all the slides and everything after. I'll share a recording after. But I promise you all this will be one of the most valuable sessions you listen to. Jay, for folks who kind of I mean this very well meaning, live under a rock in the L&D space and maybe don't know who you are, right?
Sure.
Want to just give us maybe just a quick background on how you got to where you are today and what your focus is on a day-to-day basis now?
Yeah, absolutely right. So first, I'll also just join you in welcoming everyone. For everyone just to take some time out of their schedule, their crazy schedule. It's not, everyone's going through just a lot of change these days. It's wonderful to have you. And for those that are alum or with GE, we appreciate that, and those dial in later. So I'm spending 37 years with the company, Ryan, and that it was a mix of sales marketing roles early in my career to that of Six Sigma and global supply chain roles, and then through supply chain and Six Sigma, I kind of tripped up into this area of L&D. So for the past 20 years, it's been in the sphere of leadership and development, both at the functional level and then at the leadership level. And over the past few years, having responsibility for an incredible team of global learning leaders doing regional training, functional leadership learning, and then oversight for the campus. So for those that I haven't met, we're going to clearly share some commonalities in this community of learning. And more recently, Ryan, as the company's been going through a great deal of change, and we're coming up to a big movement here in April with the final separation of our company with our Vernova energy business and our aerospace business. I've been working with this really talented team and just setting up each of the businesses with their learning organizations, their strategy, content knowledge, tech platforms, vendors. So over the past 2 years, it's culminating to this point now where each business is standing themselves up. So it's been an incredible journey over those years, and hopefully we can share a few things today.
Well, it definitely is evident that it's been a great journey. Just I can tell you by all of the notes and all the items that we're going to cover today. For folks on the call, really the big focus of today is this whole idea of how do we bring disruptive learning into a legacy organization. When Jay and I were talking about what are the most useful and timely things for folks to cover, we get all these questions about it's the age of AI, it's the age of mass transformation, it's the age of not just mass upskill, but mass reskilling efforts, right? And so all of these things are changing, but especially for global successful organizations, they're the ones who always will get hit the hardest, of course, with just needing to go through that. More tactically, what we're going to cover today is a number of different things. We'll go through what made GE's learning culture so successful. For those who don't know, it's been, I think, exactly 30 years, Jay, since GE invented the chief learning officer as a role, right? So
That's right, just over 30 years ago. In fact, the facility I'm in was invested in 1956, and there were investments made even prior to 1956. So Ryan, to your point, this has been very much built into the DNA from a practicum perspective. And it's really been our job to stay contemporary with the needs of our employees and in alignment with the strategy of the CEO and our leaders. But so it's been some years in the making, absolutely.
Absolutely. And so we'll go through what's really made that learning culture so successful, even during kind of this global reorg. Jay will give some context there. How the role of the L&D leader and the learning designers and other folks in the organization have just changed more broadly and in today's environment. We always get a lot of questions around how do we work with business unit leaders, especially, again, in a time where we've got all of this transformation happening at every business unit, right? And then how leaders should just think about that balance between how do I experiment, how do I try new things, how do I kind of be on the cutting edge, but also how do I balance that with all these things that I know are working, right? Everyone's telling me to throw out the playbook, but I have a pretty good playbook. And so how do I think about balancing those two things? And so we'll dig into all of that. But I think first, just as some kind of context setting, Jay, could you give us just kind of an overview of what the past few years at GE have been like, just to kind of set up some of the advice and info we're going to share today?
Sure, and I think we'll walk through a bit of it today on the conversation, Brian. Over the past 5 years, right, new leadership team, new board, a focus on lean capabilities and lean culture across the organization. And just over 2 years ago for the company, part of the strategy that we're now deploying is to split up the company. right? So this is a company that for years has been in what we would call this conglomerate type of model. You know, we were in the businesses of appliances at one point in time, and TV sets, NBC Universal. It's a very long list that we've been in. And part of the strategy, and it's been very well received both by customers and employees in the street, has been to set up these standalone businesses, as these franchises are multiple billions in scale, global organizations, tens of thousands of employees. So over 2 years ago, it was announced that we'd be separating the company. And a year ago, we started that path with our healthcare business being spun off a year ago. And then, as I mentioned earlier at the conversation, our Vernova energy businesses will split in April, and then our standalone aerospace business will be the GE going forward. So if you pull back and you think through that strategy from a learning perspective, we always had a centralized learning model at GE, but that was something that came about only about 10 years ago when we centralized leadership learning. So over the past 2 years, it's been, how do we set up the businesses for success for day one? And I'm just terribly impressed by being able to take that moment in time. Ryan, you'd mentioned we're going through a lot of disruption and change today. And I think for any learning leader, those are moments in time where you're able to kind of pull back and look at, well, what can we do differently to set yourself up, right? To use that moment in time, right, to try and do something different. Now, I see you've got a slide here as it relates to a large-scale deployment. Should I talk a little bit through that one just to give some further context, as this goes into more detail? So this slide, you know, and Ryan and I, as we've had conversations, as we talk about disruption, you know, one of the points I've been pondering is, you know, sometimes, you know, disruption is quite relative, right? It could be relatively smaller change, but big to that organization if they haven't seen much change, and vice versa. We have a change like this where it's changing the whole organization, right? So here's an example of what I put down as a large-scale deployment, because think of 3 business units, centralized learning services, and now we have to take our LMS system and convey that system. And we have to clone that system to stand up those businesses, right? We have an LXP system that we were able to introduce into the business. Same thing. Content, vendors, all of those things. So when you think through the complexities of all of that, I think through just the trust and the teamwork that's been able to enable this, because you're essentially doing all this work, Ryan, while still serving business as usual, right? So this example here is an example of, you know, you could throw an LMS, you could throw an LXP into this one, but this example I just kind of use and try to break it down and deconstruct this is to first having that business case need, right? And in this case, I talked about the split of the company. And the players that are involved in this one were the core learning team, not only from the corporate business units, but from the healthcare business, the Vernova energy business, the aerospace business. So having that business case need across all of those groups. Increasingly invaluable has been our digital technology and IT partners through all of this. Because I, as a functional user, have no idea as to what is happening behind the scenes, Ryan, and all the puts and takes as it relates to these larger systems, as well as the redundancy. So our DT folks keep us very grounded in these areas and help keep us on that path. You don't do this alone, right? So you think through the vendor partners you have as part of that. So key and critical. And then, of course, you got to think the learning community as well. How do you bring them along? So starting first with that business need and the players involved. And I'm sure for everyone on the webinar, you could probably plug and play a few others within that group. But then it comes to the change management side and thinking through in a very thoughtful way, who are the stakeholders that you need to involve, right? Because it's not just your function and it's not just DT doing this work. This is a whole system that helps support us. So for us, and in the cadence we built in the review process we had, and this is large scale global deployment, you know, we engaged functional leaders from our HR community, our finance community, the legal community, as you think through the work that you do in Europe with the Works Council, the sourcing community as it relates to bulk buy and just being able to bifurcate those agreements going forward. And there's going to be others. But then as you go along that path, what's been successful for us is within those business units, there are learning councils that are impacted by the work you're doing. So making sure that you're feeding into the businesses, the narratives, the talk tracks, the updates, and then the listening mechanisms to hear what their concerns are as it relates to that work. And then lastly, the user community themselves, right? What are the users feeling?
Mhm.
How are they being communicated? Because we talk so much at our learners today. How do we bring them forth and forward through all of that work? And then you go into some form of implementation, right? So generally speaking, starting with a pilot work, right, within the user community, getting that feedback, you refine from a continuous improvement, and then in time you do that scale and measure. So that's the way I kind of think through that deployment aspect. And I just see a comment here. Transformation by its definition is disruptive, right? So taking people from here to there and bringing them along as part of that journey is just so critical. So I love that comment that Thomas makes here as well, and echoing that.
Absolutely. And I think that that's something that's really important too, is that whole idea of, you mentioned piloting with the user community, and this idea that we always think of learning folks as kind of like product folks, right? You have
Yeah.
to have this sort of this user focused obsession, right? And that's what's really going to create a lot of these great learning experiences. And so on the high level transformation, we see these points about partner with these vendors and think about these functional leaders and stakeholders, right? But I think that that's also where a lot of the magic is in the details, is how are you really influencing that experience for the individual, right? And how does that change other than just things about governance or administrative overhead or things kind of on the high level of the business?
That's exactly right, Ron. And that's where, like that little bar at the bottom where
Mhm.
our role in L&D, we sit in this really interesting seat where we can kind of scan across all of that by P&L, by region, by function. And it's hard work, right? So you have kind of that engagement part up front publicly, but then behind the scenes, making sure you're getting that voice. So at times, you hear that slogan of go slow to go fast. In this case, that's what enables that change curve, Ryan, as you described.
Absolutely. And just, I know we've got a bunch of kind of nuggets in here to share with folks.
Yeah.
I think something that would be really helpful, Jay, is just the context around what did that learning culture look like historically at GE, and then how did this shift? And for folks on the call, we'll get into next what to do if this is not your organization. But what did that culture really look like?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate, right? So since the day I joined over 37 years ago, it was very well established, even though, I was more in that user community coming in new to the organization. It's just embedded in the leadership and DNA. So there's broad support. There's always been an investment made for the company. And I think there's just a big belief at the company that it matters, right? It can help on just so many different KPIs. You can look at it and clearly for us, it's about the performance aspects. How do you improve the culture of the company? But then it also it's a big value prop. So some of the ways I kind of mark that signal for myself in these experiences, Ryan, have been, what are we seeing from leadership as it relates to the funding for the programs? Leaders given permission for access to learning. We use throughout in my career, as I've gone into leadership development, from the chairman down, they're engaging both as faculty as well as stakeholders. And it's our job to kind of frame it in the right way, go back and share it in terms of learning outcomes and ways in which we can actually drive that work. And we also have to help bring leaders along as it relates to, hey, here's what works, right? So being really transparent about what we think is working in that, as well as what's not working, what we need to do different. So our leaders are very much from design perspective to faculty to the funding aspects. And I just think our leaders have just found that it acts as a competitive differentiator. And when you have a very competitive marketplace for talent expects this, right? So it's our job to continue to invest. So those are the points I would make on that.
Absolutely. And for folks on the call, we're gonna, we'll send all these slides after just to kind of quickly highlight before we keep moving here. Embedded in leadership DNA, those fundings for the new programs, access to learning, there's this real idea that we're going to, push for a lot of this from high level stakeholders, from leaders, right? We're getting inputs from all of these different folks, like our SMEs or designers, but leaders are really seen as coaches, right? And for GE, something that
That's right.
Jay had mentioned to me before is employees expect this, right? Hey, I joined GE because I know this is a place where I'm going to grow, and that may be the case for many organizations. It may not for others, and we'll get a little bit into that. But essentially, that I think is what really stood out to me and made this so powerful. I do see some folks raising hands and asking questions. Just for time's sake, throw your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we're going to make sure to reserve some time for those at the end. If you've got a question directly related to one of these things, definitely feel free to throw it in the chat, and we'll take a peek at it as well. So Jay, what if that's not my organization? What if I'm like, leaders aren't doing this, they're
Right.
not pushing for this? How should I even think about navigating this as a new person coming in, as a learning leader coming into an organization like that?
Right. And look, even in an environment like ours, it's so large, right? There are times where you're bringing leaders along as well as part of that. But this is what I would consider, and that is one, just don't wait, right? And, I've come to appreciation over the years, Ryan, as relates to what can the individual do on their own, as well as just the peer learning that can be available to you. So you just don't wait. So what I tend to suggest is go and find that leader or peer and immerse yourself into it. What I think we're really fortunate, it's like a double-edged sword, right?
Mhm.
There's so much content that's out there. And I think that's
So
part of the
much.
challenge we have, right? As in the L&D space, is finding the right content that's at the right quality, that's contextually relevant, right, for the learners that we have in the organization. That's just going to be an ongoing concern. So engage in that with no permission needed, right? What you do after hours, lunch hours, that's on your time. But I've also find that I just connect with leaders or peers that are just willing to take the time
Mhm.
and just spend some time to say, hey, can I get a half hour with you, an hour, just to understand your space, your work, how you're learning. And I tend to always come back with something different. So I think there's a lot that the individual can do if you don't have that type of culture embedded in the organization today. And for those leaders that don't want to spend time with you, it's okay. You probably don't
Mhm.
want to spend time with them either, right? If they're not going to be
Right.
embracing you around the topic of learning in the organization.
I think that's the biggest probably point to take away here, is that the culture broadly may not be at the place of learning maturity yet where they're advocating for that, but that doesn't mean that every individual leader is going to fit that mold or even wants that as a thing, right? And so you're right, you can kind of start small, engage with free things, but then go find leaders like yourself who are saying, hey, I really want to, help you advance, and I really want to help kind of shift this culture to one where learning is more at the forefront and is less of a check the box, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I would even add too, because I often will get that phone call to say, well, Jay, how did you kind of trip into learning and how did you kind of get yourself into that position? And I just found myself, one, naturally in the job when I was in Six Sigma, you're coaching others. So I just really worked on that skill base more and I watched others that did it. I also say to people, use your functional expertise to volunteer for an initiative that is being worked on today.
Mhm.
If you're a willing volunteer and you want to be able to help, I'll give you an example for us. With this lean community we have, I'm constantly pulling from subject matter experts to help solve that job.
Yeah,
So if you see something in the company that you can raise your hand in and volunteer and test the waters on with your learning team, raise your hand.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that really goes into kind of this next idea here of, when I go to raise my hand, right? How
Yeah.
should leaders kind of experiment to cultivate this in the organization? And how should I think about kind of doing that?
Yeah, right. So you're trying to do this where it's a challenging environment in itself, right? Of a gap or transformation that we're going through. I tend to look at how do you set up an environment where you can test and learn in a quick way.
Hmm.
And that tends to be very much what I think for everyone that's on the webinar, we'll tend to do from a pilot perspective and taking that and sharing that and then just learn from that and then expand that learning. You have to understand the stakeholders you're involved with. You just can't go into this blindly, right? So if you're going to be doing some functional areas, it's like, okay, who in that functional area is going to be the ones that are going to be supporting us from a change perspective? But then you also have to take in consideration, you just can't take in a new technology and launch it in a silo. You have to consider the security and data privacy needs of what you're doing for your testing. You have to understand the governance concerns that you have with that. And it's not to say to make things go slow. I think it actually accelerates it as you take a broader look. And look, again, every change has its own kind of space, right? Some things could be just smaller change that you can do a little bit faster with smaller stakeholder groups. I just think that's really important. And then you got to work across everything that touches that point of contact from a use case perspective. So looking at the business units, the vendors, et cetera, try to think as holistically as possible
Mm-hmm.
for when you do that. And you can do that because we have done that and bring people along as it relates to testing in a smaller way.
Right. And I think you can really balance those things, right? You can focus on agility and speed without saying, hey, let's kind of, burn the candle at both ends and jump right in and not consider governance or privacy. I think AI is a big portion of this. We do a lot with AI. And actually for the folks on the call, we're going to give you kind of a risk-free way to experiment with AI a little bit further into this. But something we always think about is, okay, what are the lowest risk ways to test something like AI to get really good visibility, and then to go through this process of collecting kind of use cases, inputs, right? Because you want to be really methodical about, you're kind of doing this dance of, I want to give people enough points on the board to show that this is really going to impact them, but I don't want to necessarily go embed in something or launch anything before I understand, especially with something like AI, all of the risks or how that might be contingent on the business, right? I can get into soon how with AI specifically, we've got to be careful about that. But I think just with new technology more broadly, you can look at all your partners and say, look, I've done enough to prove to you that there's potentially enough value here. Now let's go invest some time in exploring this more deeply and being really thorough with it as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad how you describe that as the dance. I call it the elegant dance, right? As you're bringing people and partners along the way.
Absolutely. And I think back to this whole idea of kind of experimenting, what the role
Yep.
of an L&D leader is in this. I think whether it's experimentation, whether it's setting up the function, right, a lot has obviously changed in the past few years. What are some of the biggest impacts and changes you've just seen for expectations for L&D functions and just for the role of an L&D leader more broadly as all of this is
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah. So I think we're all feeling this, right? And I love that reflective question, Ryan, as it relates to what we are seeing. Clearly, one is cycle time, right? There were days in the past where you could work in periods of months for a program design and then deploy. Those cycle times are coming down now to weeks, right? So you're seeing a drastic change in cycle time. I think I shared this a little bit earlier. I think some new capabilities that are being required of the L&D folks, right? So as we've been building up our business units for learning, bringing in marketing communications to help users cipher through what's relevant and what's not, and the paths that they have access to. The way that you manage the learning portfolio, because there's just so many different competing interests for people's time, and that's just not a traditional capability for L&D. Data analytics, we have a data analytics capability now within our business units to understand where are employees spending their time,
Mm-hmm.
right? So whether it's content that you've created organically or content that you're working with third parties, really understand where people are spending their time. So that whole area of data analytics is really important. Look, everything's becoming more personalized. That's clearly the path we have going forward, which is wonderful, given all of the content that we have around us. But I think we're also going to continue to see consolidation of tech platforms and just the need for us to continue to experiment. When we talk about AI, right? And I think we just need to, at times, just step back a little bit and assess, right? Some of these things that we have from a governance perspective, data sources, those areas still matter, right, as it relates to it. But then you get excited as it relates to what it can bring to the user community. And then look, with programs that may be like a 1 or 2 year program or multi-month, I think just having this mindset, Brian, of saying you're just never done.
Mm-hmm.
And you're keeping in some built-in capability of experimentation at a given time to keep improving in that program.
Absolutely. And so I think just kind of as a highlight for folks, that shift to, you've heard us mention things like speed while being thoughtful a few times on this. Like months to weeks really is the expectation, right? And thinking about something I love what Jay said is this whole idea of added competencies, right? For comms, for marketing, because you're competing against others' time. We've run internal surveys at Arist and found that about 40% of an L&D professional's time is spent creating content. If you look at the team as a whole and average that time, and another 30-40% is basically working as marketing professionals, right? And convincing people to go take learning, sending emails, doing change management, right? And if you think about how a lot of these teams are structured and how we were originally brought into L&D, that wasn't necessarily the premise. It was more academic than that. And hey, let's create, really great learning experiences. But I feel like there was almost this unspoken expectation of, okay, build it and they will come, or you're going to build these things, then you're going to have to, you now have the responsibility to get all these people to come to that, right? And I think that the past few years, we've really seen L&D leaders be really smart about this, but also kind of wake up to this idea of, at the end of the day, we're launching a technology product, right? Not just a syllabus. And so we've got to get adoption for a technology product, the same that anyone would if they were launching anything else internally, right? So there is this whole transformation and change management idea to it as well. I think that's a really good segue just into this next part here, just about how to work with business unit leaders effectively. And so we talk about marketing and comms and sales, and we're talking about speed to L&D, right? And this whole idea that there's just this different expectation now for L&D leaders. How should we as L&D leaders think about how to work with business unit leaders when all these expectations have changed?
Yeah, right. And there's only so many resources you have, right, to be able to go out and really try to understand. And I think, look, where you have the opportunities, live in their space, understand their priorities, their gaps, their measures. Particularly when you get into functional areas, that may be a little bit easier to do, but the more time you spend living in their environment and understanding how they face their challenges is always helpful for you as you look at design and outcomes. And then there's always this notion, Ryan, as we talked about, with centralized services, right, for the organization. And you're constantly, at least I am constantly looking for what's that common thread for something where a business unit couldn't do it on their own, right? So where can you find a common thread that just brings more value or more speed to the organization and give that business unit just a better outcome than if they were to try to run that play on their own? And I oftentimes see in organizations today, I just think it's so challenging in the L&D space that we have. The more that you have in your L&D community together, even if they don't report to you, the better everyone is, because you're all facing into similar challenges. In fact, Ryan, you're oftentimes finding redundant content as part of that as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's the biggest thing there, right? How can you give a business unit a better outcome than they can get on their own? We hear from a lot of leaders today, Jay, about, I heard someone last week, a CLO, she said to me, we're worried that there are, she called them shadow L&D organizations popping up in different functions because maybe sales or marketing or ops is saying, well, I put it into a, similar to what we saw with, with IT like 15, 20 years ago, right? Oh, well, I put it into a backlog and I had to wait a certain amount of time. And so then it's actually how Salesforce became a thing, right? I don't want to go through some sort of central IT owner. I want to try to manage this myself, right? And I think that, centralizing and decentralizing is kind of a balance. There's not always a better way to do it. I think there's better for the organization or for the need, but I think for a lot of L&D folks, there's this whole idea of when we're really centralized, which many are, how do we make sure that that's not happening? And how do we, because there is a lot of expertise held in the L&D function, but if we're not kind of quick to respond to some of these things or able to explain to a business unit, how can we get you a better outcome, even if it's worth waiting a little bit longer, then we're just going to see that, that gap just get wider and wider and wider.
And we've experienced exactly that, Ryan, right? And we've seen that over time. And your job is to try to stay as close to that as you possibly can. I even see in the comment here, KPIs, their priorities, right? Those are all important. So again, just that contextual nature is just so important in all of this.
Absolutely. And we'll get to it at the end. I saw a great question about that as well. But for folks, keep the questions coming. They're looking fantastic. I think just back to the idea of business unit leaders, Jay had given me this slide before. He's got this really, really interesting idea about how to align with the CEO and sponsors. Jay, do you want to just briefly talk us through some of the key points here?
Yeah, so when you're in learning and you have the CEO and chairman talking through their approach to a deployment in front
Mhm,
of investors, this was put in front of investors back in 2021. So
mhm,
we're talking 3 years ago. The learning team was part of this, right? And that's what I just love because as Larry talked through the building of the foundation, there was a Kaizen promotion office that was built, and the learning team was part of that organization in developing the standards, developing the content, and focusing on our top leaders, which then led us into the scaling of where we refined and matured the framework. We integrated these into the P&Ls, and then we continue to build out the resources and needs based at the front end, not only from what we saw and would be able to feed back into the system, but also to what our leadership team saw. And then just broader adoption that naturally came out of this, where you're making in these areas like practices of Kaizen and Hoshin available to the organization. And now you're talking through it's now the way you do work, but that's a 3+ year journey, Ryan. And as we say in a continuous improvement environment, you're just never done
mhm.
in that work. But in each of these stages, you got to be patient, right? Depending upon the size of the organization and the amount of change that you're trying to drive. And when learning can play a key role as part of that enablement, that's when you feel really good about the work you're doing.
Absolutely. And I think back to that whole point, there's probably some leaders on the call who are saying, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like I wish I could get, my CEO and stakeholders to have that kind of buy-in," right? For folks who've been on Arist webinars in the past, you know that I love to kind of get into some tactics or some takeaways there. One thing we did want to show folks is how we can use something like AI to rapidly show value to business units, right? You heard Jay and I talk about this whole idea of we got to balance being quick and showing some sort of results and getting excitement with also being really thorough when we actually go to do that deployment. Jay had a quote that I stole here that I love. How can we make learning the first phone call? And we think that showcasing things like this, even just preliminarily or in a demo instance, as a learning team is how we can be that first phone call. Hey, Jay, that was really cool. Can my sales team, comms team, transformation team, can we come check that out? So I'm going to briefly show this here. Oops, mute that. I'll just talk through this for a moment. So essentially, for folks who don't know, Arist is our company that's running this webinar. Essentially, what we do is deliver learning where people spend all their time on tools like SMS, Microsoft Teams, WhatsApp, email, Slack. The core premise is that people spend over 1,000x as much time in a tool like that versus a LMS or LXP. And so for really mission critical, high adoption needed, high impact trainings, those are the types of things that we're often used for. So this is a great example of AI, and we've actually made this free. I'll give everyone a link at the end to go try this out. But essentially, this is called Sidekick. It's our AI. So if we come into the Arist system here, this is an example from the pharmaceutical industry. And so we've got a bunch of Paxlovid documentation from Pfizer and their team, what we're going to do in this instance. And this just shows you kind of the capabilities of AI is we're going to take all of this documentation. Before it was this massive PDF we couldn't get folks to read. And so the L&D team took this from the sales team and said, okay, we're going to upload this into, a tool like Sidekick here. We're going to, give it these different prompts, right? This is us prompting the AI. So in this case, the topic is understanding it and prescribing it. Our audience is clinicians. Our purpose is helping them understand what it is and how to properly prescribe it. I think the benefit here, Jay, is that we are, essentially, there's a number of different things that are happening here, right? One is that it's a fully closed loop system. And so none of this company proprietary info is being pulled in. Two is that we've trained this on over 1 million Arist courses at this point. And so it's using a lot of learning design thinking. How much scenario, analysis do I use, right? When should I prompt for understanding versus check for application of knowledge? And then the third thing that's really important is it is pulling from company specific info, but it's also using a lot of the OpenAI APIs and those things to kind of restructure that learning. And the goal here really is that it's a sidekick, right? AI can still invent, it can hallucinate, but if we give a learning leader an output, that's enough to show them, okay, here's the output. You're a curator now, right? Not a creator as much, but you're doing more curation. The benefit is that we can go in there and we can show this to business unit leaders and say, look, here's the types of capabilities I've taught my learning team how to do. We can be a really fast partner to you, right? It might take us a little bit of time to deploy this type of learning, but now we're going to avoid all these business units circumventing the L&D function when they look at this and say, hey, learning can get me something right away, right? And in this case, we're going to go ahead we can hit, generate outline. If you blink, you might miss it, but essentially it's gonna output a full outline for us. I won't go through this too much in depth, but in this case, we see it goes through introduction to the drug here, dosing schedules. Again, this was something L&D made for sales teams, drug prescriptions and interactions. This is just the outline, dealing with those use and edge cases. Because I prompted it with how to prescribe it to patients, it's going through that. And again, the benefit is once we go ahead, edit this outline as an L&D team, say, hey, this looks good, we can go ahead and hit generate course, and then we can have a full course output right here with questions, with scenarios, et cetera. Again, the expectation being this is handed to the L&D professional. They can go in there, they can edit or adjust, and then they can go pass it back or deploy that to the business unit team. In this case, it was, the sales team and the commercial team who's trying to roll out a product, right? Jay, you've been in L&D obviously far longer than myself. Any just reflections on what this type of technology really means for L&D leaders more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, look, just in that short period of time, you just think about this from an instructional design perspective, right? Where you're able to, as long as you're able to control the data feeds it's only good as the data feeds you pull in, right? And it's got to come in without bias, et cetera. You just look at that cycle time reduction in it. There's still a human editor in this process, right? So the instructional designer is still important. But I think through just, how quickly, remember I was talking through months to weeks?
Mm-hmm.
You're doing in some cases here in days, right? That you're able to do. So for me, it's a matter of, okay, the efficiency we're able to gain and just getting comfortable with the technology versus being threatened with it, right? And then how do you as a learning team kind of go through that yourself and then have those reflections to yourself together to just improve upon that, which is really important. So this is just a great example. And this is one I think just is really exciting as we continue to move forward on this path of technology.
Yeah, and it really allows L&D to lead the charge, right? I think that's the most exciting thing, 100%. Jay, we've got a little bit of time left here. For folks on the call, we're gonna go for a few more minutes, and then we're gonna start jumping to these questions. We'll maybe go, 5 or 10 after the 45 mark there.
That's good.
Jay, how should leaders really balance all of this rapid disruption that we're talking about with all of these existing programs, long-term strategy, especially for a company like GE, where we've got all this stuff that works, and we see a bunch of new stuff like what I just showed?
Yeah. So look, I think you still got to stay grounded on priorities, right? You can't confuse your team. You can't confuse the organization. So being really clear on your focus, just as we were showing that scaling of lean in the organization, that was year by year, right? So staying really clear about your priorities and what's needed now is important, but then recognizing that you're never done. And I've probably said this like 6 times plus around the continuous improvement and experimentation side. And then, as you have that roadmap, don't forget about that roadmap. I always think about the programs that we designed. They're living organisms, right? You're constantly looking at ways in which you can change the experience. And you want to stay ahead of the curve. But you have to do that with feedback mechanisms as well. So you're getting some type of guardrails for response as to how fast you're going with that change.
Absolutely. And I think just to kind of, for folks for the notes here, being ahead of the curve, setting a roadmap, and just again, to double down on what Jay said, we've got our clear priorities, but it is a living organism. We're focusing on constant improvement, right? And so kind of this balance between here's a roadmap, here's where we're going, here's the strategy, but I'm going to be really intentional about making these little, I'll call them detours, right? Very well intentioned, but these little kind of checks. Okay, this could be relevant. Let's experiment with it. Let's try this. And then let's bring this back in. I think more tactically, Jay, to that last point there, how much should we do that experimentation? We're thinking, you've got a really good philosophy here when we think about staying the course versus having team members try new stuff.
Right. Remember how we talked a bit around, all disruptions are not equal, right? So look, so I do think as it relates to this space, as it relates to experimentation, it really depends on where you are in that curve of introduction, Ryan. Mm-hmm. So my thought process was, rule of thumb, if you have an established program that's been tried and true, you're going to focus 80 to 90% of if it's established, you got 80 to 90% staying focused on that core program, right? But if it's brand new space, you're going to flip that around where it's going to be like 80% of experimentation as well, right? So you see where I'm going with that? Yeah. You have continuous improvement in one. The other one is, look, it is brand new to the world. So in that scaled out area of curriculum that we had a lot of experimentation going on upfront. And now over time, we're keeping that 10, 20% of change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the biggest thing there, right? It's not, folks always ask me, like, should we kind of flip the whole playbook on this? Should we try to experiment here? It's like, well, if this works, stay on it and have something separate but intentional for, okay, AI is an example of that space. We should spend most of our time in AI on experimentation and exploration rather than at this stage saying, here's our plan for 2 or 3 years, right? But for, maybe our manager leadership development program that's been working great for years, we shouldn't necessarily just throw that whole thing away either.
Exactly.
Jay, as kind of a last point here, and then we'll jump to any questions. Looking forward, tons of disruption, tons of things changing. What's your broad advice for L&D leaders going into this year and next year?
Yeah. So look, you hit on it with AI. If there's not a conversation that doesn't happen with AI as of late, let alone just the changes for all of our companies that we're going through collectively. I think this is just a huge opportunity for the learning group and community to help demystify the application of that and get people from, Ryan, what I'm finding as I spend more time immersing myself in the topic, you have these leaders that are like frightened by this, but they may not want to admit that, right? And you have others that are just like super excited, right? And you want to make sure that people are still within good grounding of our governance rules and our data privacy rules, et cetera. And you want to help people through that journey. So I think we sit at a great place, one, for us to be more intelligent in understanding in the application of AI and going through that collectively, but then helping the organizations broadly improve upon that. This notion of organic creation and ubiquitous skills is turning more into what I think is this curation piece, right? So what is the best content for your use case that meets all of the requirements of your company? And it's at a high quality level. So those are ways in which I think we continue to look forward relative to our roles, let alone the change curve we're helping to drive and instill across all of our organizations.
Absolutely. I think that recognition too of are we frightened or excited by it? And again, to the point of, what we showed with the AI, L&D leaders taking that first step again. I love the phrase demystify its application, right? Yeah. Everyone's saying, "Oh my gosh, AI is going to invent and it's going to hallucinate," right? And what we found is that's true, but the most common question we actually get about the AI capabilities is, oh, is the AI going in and responding to learners? And it's like, no, well, I could see how that would be quite scary because you've got this total inconsistency of experience, especially in some of these industries, like the pharmaceutical industry, right? I mentioned before, you're just going to have inaccurate information, right? But that doesn't mean you can't use AI to create, and then we actually will watermark it in the system and then have a human intervention like a subject matter expert go approve it. And so I think folks can be really smart with how they do that when folks are using things like ChatGPT, as they have been for a year and a half. No one goes and asks it to write a dissertation and then publishes that, right? They might use it as a research buddy and go check for some of that information and understanding. And I think that is that kind of dance with AI and that understanding of that relationship with something like AI is really, really important, because otherwise we should be frightened of it, right? If we're just giving it the reins fully, so. Well, Jay, really, just thank you so much. Appreciate the time. For folks on the call, we're going to stay on for another few minutes and just answer some of these awesome questions I see in the Q&A here. One thing we're going to leave you with is, if you do want to try out a public-facing version of the AI that I showed for free, my recommendation, try this out, build a basic course outline in it, and go show your leaders and use this to say, look, L&D's got a lot of these capabilities. This is how we can really help the business, and go kind of show a lot of that to business unit leaders as well. Jay, thank you so much again for your time. Let's go through a few of the questions here. A few of the one that I really liked was, in my experience, one of the challenges with L&D is that the desire and aspiration to learn is there, but it falls in important rather than urgent category and is often neglected despite best intentions. What are the strategies and tactics you can use to overcome this?
So Ryan, the way you interpret that one is, is, we see the need for it, but then our user base or stakeholders don't see it. Is that the way you're interpreting that question?
Yeah, I'm interpreting this as like we've got, in the L&D organization, we say, hey, there's all this stuff we want to do, but it's important, but there's not really like an urgency or a timeline to it, right? And so it does kind of get deprioritized, right? And so how do we kind of push for that
Yeah.
urgency and that prioritization as a function?
Yeah. So I like that question because for me, that's an alignment question,
Mhm.
frankly, right? So I'll give you an example of which we briefly touched upon. New CEO into the company, driving lean culture and lean capabilities. If our team wasn't aligned to be able to understand and prioritize what was important to the leadership team,
Mhm.
it's just not going to matter as much. I mean, and that may just speak to the company I'm in, but I'd ask myself, well, why is that? Is it because, is it the right work that's being done? So are we working on what's important to the organization? I'd be asking that question. I'd be asking, do we have the right stakeholders involved? Am I seeing something that they're not seeing, and how do I bring that to their attention? Right. So that tends to be more question based to say, I've got to do a little bit more work to understand what's being pulled and then what's being pushed, because you always want to be in that harmony and alignment of where the organization has a gap. And this is where the partnering side, Ryan, is so important. And for our organization, we've always been really close, not to just the leadership in general, but our HR communities where they're having a sense of skill gap and culture gap,
Yeah.
focusing on those gaps and being part of that solution. So I hope that helps in some way.
It definitely does. And I think that's actually a good segue to the next question in terms of partnering with the business unit leaders, which again has been a big theme of what we talked about today.
Yes.
Jesse had a question. How do you recommend L&D professionals manage a lot of those intakes or requests? Is there an intake process that GE follows or something similar in a way that you think about that?
Yeah. So when it comes to like large company initiatives, that tends to be a much shorter list of people that we engage with.
Mhm.
So for example, what we showed here, we had engagement with the chairman, the CHRO, the Kaizen promotion office, and the lean community as we were building that lean capability out to the organization, as well as the HR community. We did have in the past, so part of the other question of where, okay, you're a large company, you have needs coming into the system. Well, how do you cipher that? We had in the past, and the new business units that are managing this as well, where it was a design intake, Ryan, for lack of better terms. So if somebody had a request at any P&L or region, they could go into this location at L&D and put the request in to say, hey, this is what my need is. And then our design teams would first look to see, do we have a solution for that today? And like 80% of the time we did. And we had a service level commitment to go back to those employees that were asking for stuff to be able to cycle back and serve that need. So we had to kind of like from ground up, but most of the work, just given the construct of where we're at, has been with the leadership team. But I think there's also a little bit more into that question. That is, you can have a lot of people knocking on your door, right, as it relates to, well, this is important, this is what I need, this is important, this is what I need. And you do have to recognize, this is where it gets back to prioritization, where you just have to be able to say, hey, look, here's where this is in scope of what we can do. We would love to entertain this, but for us to be able to entertain this, here are some of the things we need to think through. You don't totally dismiss that individual, but you can only do what you're capable of with a little bit of stretch. So helping people understand where your focus area is and trying to provide a solution, but it may not come from your group. It may be external in those situations as well, right? So it goes back to that elegant dance piece of it as well, Ryan, in managing that stakeholder community.
100%. And another question just came in. I know we've talked about this a lot about how L&D should partner with these different organizations to understand the learning needs. And I think a few of the themes you just mentioned are really how, L&D thinks about doing that. Go sit with them, spend time with those leaders, really trying to understand what are their priorities. Because if it's not a priority like a high level priority for the business unit and aligned to their goals, it's probably not going to be a priority
It's
for
not going to hit their radar, Ryan, right? And look, I can speak to an extent of large global L&D infrastructure at one point in time, right? That the businesses now have been making that capability of. We had functional learning leaders that would work across all of the P&Ls to gather the inputs in for that function, whether it was HR learning or finance, and we look for that common thread. That was very helpful for us to be able to have, here's our core leadership
right.
house, right? Here's our functional leadership, and they're engaging with the businesses. And then for us at the centralized location, we're engaging with the business learning leaders to make sure we're hearing their voice and their needs to help change the design. In fact, Ryan, there was a question up earlier around these learning councils.
Mm-hmm.
What I find in many business units, there are these learning councils at the business unit level of where they're aggregating all of their functional learning leaders together on a monthly cadence. Mm-hmm. To talk about what are best practices, what are good practices in governance, what's the tech platforms we're working with, right? That can drive a lot of synergy. And then when you're at the corporate level, you engage with the business unit that then engages with the learning councils to help bring that along. So that's more kind of a structural engagement in those learning councils. There's not been one of where it's not been value added, non-value added, because you're again looking at a common need that a learning leader has, even if it's embedded back to those shadow organizations within those shadow organizations that you have. People tend to look for other help, and you're better for that.
Right. Last question we'll take here, Jay, and then we'll wrap, is just, I've read one of the best ways to promote learning in an organization is to find ways of integrating it in the flow of work and make it more of a social and collaborative process. What's your experience with peer-to-peer learning within organizations?
Oh, I mean, we build it in as well. Can't agree more. In fact, for many of those on the webinar, right, they're very familiar with the 70-20-10 application. We had a learning leadership team, just exceptional at their craft and what they did, and they built and designed around that. So in many of these multi-month programs that we had, right, so we went back in the days of, Ryan, of where you're face-to-face for a couple of weeks and even 3 weeks at one point in time to now multi-month, where they built that in, where you're learning, the concept on day one. You've got some form of coach or subject matter expert guiding you throughout the week. And then you're engaging with your peer community because they're dealing with the same problems, right? And when you find yourself out in the business, and you're facing into a big problem, it's usually your peer community that's going to help you through that. So we designed that in as part of every program we have because it's just such a critical component. So learn the content. You have a coach, apply, share further with your peer learning, and go back into the next topic. That sequence has been very important and critical into our design.
I love that. Well, hey, for folks on the call, thank you so much for tuning in. Jay, a huge thank you again from all of us just for taking the time. Yeah. If folks have other questions, I had my email up there. It's just ryan@arist.co. Feel free to email me and I can pass those along to Jay. And then we will send the slides and recording from this to everyone later today. Jay, thank you so much again. And, wishing you all the best with all the amazing kind of challenges up next.
Hey, Ryan, thank you. Thanks for everyone that engaged in all the great questions on the shared need that we all have today. So appreciate the time and the opportunity.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Take care.